We'll now move on to our final speaker for the side proposition. The final speaker is Toby Young. Toby is a British journalist and the London associate editor at Quillette. He has written extensively for The Sun on Sunday, The Daily Mail, The Telegraph and The Spectator. Toby also established the Lockdown Skeptics newsletter, which has been in circulation since the first national lockdown. Toby, you have our ears.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be addressing the Cambridge Union again, albeit in difficult circumstances. I think the fundamental case that those of us on this side of the debate, the fundamental argument is that if a government is going to deprive its citizens of their civil liberties, it needs to have a very good reason for doing so. I think it needs to be able to show that in the absence of curtailing, of suspending our civil liberties, colossal harm would be caused to the population. And if it can't do that, if it can't demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that suspending our civil liberties is absolutely necessary to prevent harm, then I don't think it's justified in doing so. And I think one of the most shocking things about the decision our government made on March 23rd to essentially imprison the population of Britain in their homes indefinitely at that point, though they did say 3 weeks, is that they never carried out a cost-benefit analysis. They took the decision to suspend our civil liberties. I think Lord Sumption has made the point that civil liberties haven't been suspended on this scale ever before in Britain's history, including during wartime. They took that decision without carrying out even the most rudimentary cost-benefit analysis. There was a great piece in the FT about the week leading up to that momentous decision on March 23rd. It wrote about the actual Cobra meeting where that decision was announced. To many people's surprise at that meeting, it was chaired not by Boris but by Michael Gove. And Jesse Norman put his hand up in that meeting towards the end and asked Michael Gove if the government had carried out a cost-benefit analysis to satisfy themselves that these draconian measures, historically unprecedented suspension of our ancient liberties, that these would create prevent more harm than they caused. And I think he was expecting Michael Gove to say, yes, we have carried out that analysis, and yes, we can say with confidence that is the case, which is why we're taking this drastic step. Instead, he got a blank look. It was as though it hadn't even occurred to the government to carry out the most rudimentary cost-benefit analysis before suspending our liberties. And that was really shocking. Okay, that doesn't mean that lockdowns, the lockdown imposed then and subsequently, haven't prevented more harm than they've caused. But I think there is overwhelming evidence that they haven't. Now, Laura said when she spoke earlier that lockdowns were not historically unprecedented, that they've been tried many times before. They're, in effect, the default way, the default policy response to dealing with a pandemic. But I did a bit of research for lockdown skeptics on this issue. The only instance I could find, well, the earliest instance I could find of a lockdown being imposed on a population during a pandemic was Florence in 1631. As far as I could tell, in the Spanish flu pandemic, some cities which did impose restrictions are often praised for managing that pandemic better than those that didn't. And St. Louis is often singled out for praise, where churches and schools were closed, business hours were restricted, people were ordered to wear masks in public. But St. Louis never issued a stay-at-home order. As far as I know, it only ordered the closure of business activities for a 48-hour period. There was no lockdown imposed during the Hong Kong flu epidemic of 67 to 69, which killed a comparable number of people, though the ranges, the estimates vary. There was no lockdown imposed in 57 to 58 to deal with the Asian flu pandemic. During the swine flu pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, the only country which quarantined its entire population, the healthy as well as the sick, was Mexico. And Mexico abandoned that policy after 18 days because of the mounting social and economic costs. So I don't think it is the default go-to policy response. It was, I think, almost an unprecedented policy innovation when it was pioneered by the Chinese communist authorities at the beginning of last year. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the WHO, in a document in 2019 about how we should mitigate the impact of another pandemic, recommended against quarantining the healthy as well as the sick, and our own pandemic preparedness strategy, which was last updated in February of last year, but which an enormous amount of work had gone into. That didn't recommend quarantining the healthy as well as the sick either. So I don't think you can claim that this was the default, obvious go-to response. So I do think the government, before suspending our liberties in the way it did, should have carried out at least a rudimentary cost-benefit analysis. And incidentally, they still haven't done that, in spite of being asked to do it by the COVID recovery group in the House of Commons on numerous occasions. But I think the evidence that lockdowns don't work, that they don't reduce overall COVID mortality, is pretty persuasive. I'll refer people to a collection of these studies published in peer-reviewed, respectable academic journals. I think there are 30 of them collated on a website called In Proportion To. The American Institute for Economic Research collated them. If you do a Google on AIE, the American Institute for Economic Research, and lockdown policies, you'll find that list. Nearly all of these studies find that the lockdowns were largely ineffective, that they didn't reduce overall COVID mortality where they were imposed. And you can see this if you compare, you would expect if lockdowns work, the more severe the lockdown, the lower the overall COVID mortality. And we don't see that pattern in the data. The Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford has compiled an index of just how severe the various lockdowns that have been imposed around the world have been. And there's no correlation between the severity of the non-pharmaceutical interventions made by different governments and COVID mortality. If you look at those US states that locked down last year, that imposed shutdowns, and those that didn't, actually the average deaths per million from COVID are lower in those states that didn't shut down compared to those that did. As I think Graham Brady, or maybe it was Richard Tice, said, if you compare the impact of COVID on Florida and California, there doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that the more draconian lockdown restrictions imposed in California benefited the population of California, because much less draconian restrictions in Florida were imposed, and Florida has a much lower number of deaths per million from COVID than California. And you can control for things like the age of the population, for climate, for hours of sunlight. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all. However much you play around with those variables, there's no signal in the noise. There isn't any statistical, empirical evidence that lockdowns are effective. I mean, turning to this country, Phil, you said that you could see a decline in infections, hospital admissions, and COVID deaths in response to each lockdown being imposed. I'm afraid that's just not right. If you look at the first lockdown, if you assume that the period of time between infection and death for those unfortunate enough to succumb to COVID-19 is around about 3 weeks, the point at which deaths began to decline in England suggests that the infections started to decline before the lockdown was imposed on March 23rd. If you go 3 weeks back from the infection peak in April, you go back further than the date at which the lockdown was imposed, which suggests that infections were beginning to fall before our liberties were taken away. And that was also confirmed by Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer of England, when he testified before a House of Commons Select Committee. He acknowledged that infections were beginning to fall before the first lockdown was imposed. And as Graham Brady said, the Zoe app data suggests that that's also true of the third lockdown. So I don't think there's any really persuasive evidence that lockdowns are an effective way of reducing overall COVID mortality. But there is, as both Graham and Richard have said, an overwhelming amount of evidence that the lockdown policy causes colossal harm. And I don't just mean it causes harm to economies, though, as Laura acknowledged, there is no you can't contrast economic damage with damage to public health. The two completely go hand in hand. And one of the estimates the World Bank has made is that as a consequence of the global economic recession, largely caused by these lockdowns that have been enacted across the world as countries fall over themselves to copy the Chinese communist regime, as a consequence of the global economic recession, an estimated 150 million people in the developing world are going to be plunged into extreme poverty by the end of this year. But in addition, there is the enormous damage to people's mental health. We see a spike in deaths from despair, things like drug overdoses in the US as a result of shutdowns across America. We see the enormous damage to children's education from closing schools, and it's damage, as we know, that falls most heavily on the most disadvantaged. And often the impact, the damage, the harm caused by lockdown policies is borne by the poorest people in our society, the most disadvantaged. So it's been a great surprise to me that people on the progressive left haven't made more noise objecting to the impact of lockdowns, given that the burden is being borne by the most disadvantaged people in our society. It's all very well for the members of SAGE to advocate this policy. They have gardens, they have garden offices, they live in pleasant, comfortable surroundings. Doesn't make much odds to them. But if you live in a council flat at the top of a tower block and you have 4 kids you're trying to homeschool and only 1 computer, this is a really catastrophic policy. The counter-argument to the, I don't think you could claim that the damage to children's education, the spike in deaths from despair, that collateral damage, I don't think you can claim that that hasn't been caused by the lockdown policy. But I think you could argue that the catastrophic economic consequences are a pandemic effect and not an effect of the lockdown. But if we look at previous pandemics, like the Asian flu pandemic, like the Hong Kong flu epidemic, they had nothing like this impact on the global economy. In the UK, for instance, there was no lockdown in response to the Asian flu pandemic of 57 to 58. And yes, the economy did contract. It contracted for 1 quarter in 58 by 2.5%. That was it. By contrast, last year, the UK economy contracted by over 20% in Q2 alone. So I don't think you can argue that the catastrophic economic harm unleashed by the lockdown policies pursued around the world have caused untold economic damage, which is we're going to be living with the repercussions of that, paying off the 400 billion debt for generations to come. I think just often when people make this case against lockdown, that the harms clearly outweigh the benefits, and that for that reason the government should never have suspended our liberties in the way it did. People say, yes, but it's a deadly disease. We have to protect the NHS. What alternative is there to trying to interrupt transmission, reduce hospital admissions by asking everyone to stay in their homes? Well, first of all, I don't think that has had a major impact on reducing hospital admissions. But secondly, the people who are opposed to lockdown skeptics like me, our policy is not just to let the virus rip as an alternative to lockdowns, as it's often caricatured as being. Our alternative is the policy recommended in the Great Barrington Declaration, which has been signed by tens of thousands of public health scientists and medical professionals. I believe the number of signatories it's got now is above 700,000 altogether, though ordinary people can sign it too. But the policy recommended in the Great Barrington Declaration is focused protection, cocooning those who are most vulnerable to this disease. And I think if we'd done that from the beginning, the NHS would have been under much less pressure over the past year than it has been, and we'd have a lower COVID death toll. As I think both Graham and Richard have pointed out, if lockdowns are such an effective way to manage this virus, why, having locked down 3 times, does the UK have the 5th highest number of COVID deaths per million in the world? Just in the final stretch now, Laura mentioned various countries in Asia that she said had managed this pandemic better than us. I think she mentioned Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam. That's all true. But Laura, all of those countries imposed much less severe lockdowns than we've done in the UK and more generally in Europe. And yet they have a much lower number of deaths per million than we do. They did much smarter things than use the blunt instrument of lockdown. They didn't quarantine their healthy as well as their sick for extended periods of time like we've done. They imposed port of entry controls, particularly on travellers from China, at a very early stage following the outbreak of the pandemic. And that was an effective policy. NERVTAB, incidentally, were asked to consider that policy twice in January and twice rejected it. So I think, Phil, you mentioned the infection fatality rate in the UK being about 0.5%. I won't argue with you, but there was a recent WHO bulletin which said globally the IFR, initially they estimated it in this bulletin at 0.27%. That was revised downwards to 0.23%. But it's worth remembering that that is stratified by age. And I don't think anyone disputes that the older you are and the more comorbidities you have, the more vulnerable you are to this disease. But I'm not sure whether people grasp just how invulnerable you are to it if you don't fall into those vulnerable categories. So the estimated infection fatality rate, if you're under 65 and have no comorbidities, is about 0.05, which is lower than the estimated infection fatality rate of seasonal flu. We saw last year, and this is NHS data, that the number of people who died in English hospitals from COVID-19 who were under 60 and had no underlying health issues numbered 388. So the focused protection strategy, I think, makes sense. Let's devote our resources. Let's have a national effort. Let's mobilize the country to protect the people that are most vulnerable to this disease. And let's let other people who are less vulnerable to it than they are to seasonal flu go about their lives, but nonetheless taking sensible precautions as they would during a normal flu season. That seems to me to be a much more logical, sensible response, much more in keeping with the WHO's advice in 2019, with our own pandemic preparedness strategy, with the way in which we've managed previous pandemics, than this crazy, draconian imposition of a lockdown, which there's very little evidence actually succeeds in reducing transmissions.